True crime as a media genre has captivated the minds of a generation as one of the most popular subjects in modern-day media. There are endless amounts of documentaries, podcasts, web series, and blogs dedicated to telling the stories of criminals, victims, and investigators as they unravel the mysteries of cold cases. There are many ways to explain why true crime as a genre has risen to become as popular as it has. Practically speaking, advancements in forensic science have allowed decades-old cold cases to be solved years after the crimes were committed. In the era of fingerprinting, blood splatter experts, toxicology, and DNA testing, there are few details that escape forensic investigators at a crime scene. However, forensic dentistry, that is, comparing the teeth of a victim or the bite marks of a perpetrator to previous dental records, was first used in the United States as evidence in a murder trial long before DNA testing and long before forensic science as we know it today. We're here on Sumac Path in Mount Auburn Cemetery to tell the story of the murder of George Parkman in 1849, how it shook Boston to its core as one of the most high-profile murder cases in the history of the country, and also how it put forensic dentistry on the map.
George Parkman belonged to a select elite community called the Boston Brahmin in the 19th century. He was a well-known celebrity in the community as a member of one of the wealthiest families of Boston.
Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. once commented on Parkman, saying, "He abstained while others indulged. He walked while others rode. He worked while others slept." Fanny Longfellow and her husband, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, endearingly called him the lean doctor, the good-natured Don Quixote. George Parkman was mainly a physician, but he was also a powerful landlord. He was often spotted roaming the streets of Boston looking to collect on the debts owed to him on his properties. He began attending Harvard University at the age of 15, and later in his life he would run in similar circles as others from the Harvard Medical School, such as the less than dependable John White Webster.
John Webster was also from a well-to-do family of merchants who enjoyed a very privileged life from his youth. He was often described as petulant and fussy, but was known amongst his colleagues at the Harvard Medical School as a kind person, albeit nervous and excitable. As Webster grew older, he ran into more and more financial troubles. His family had lost their mansion in Cambridge, and Webster himself was in debt to many of his friends.
The trouble between Webster and Parkman began when, in 1842, Parkman conceded a small loan to Webster. By 1847, that loan had not been repaid. To settle tempers, Webster offered a collateral for his loan, a small cabinet of valuable minerals. However, Parkman would later find out that Webster had offered that same cabinet of minerals as collateral for a different loan that he took from Robert Gould Shaw. Furious, George Parkman set out to get his money. George Parkman accosted a cashier at the Harvard Medical School, demanding that he hand over any of the money that John Webster had earned selling tickets to his lectures. A day later, Webster would find Parkman at his home on Beacon Hill and suggest that the two of them meet at his Harvard Medical School office that afternoon at 1:30 p.m. on November 23rd.
The last known sighting of George Parkman alive was 1:45 p.m. that day as he entered the medical college wearing a dark frock coat, a purple satin vest, and a stovepipe hat. John Webster was next seen at 6 p.m. that evening attending a dinner party, showing no outward signs of distress.
The city was abuzz with rumors about what could have happened to this prominent Boston Brahmin figure who disappeared without a trace. Some suspected that Irish immigrants were to blame. Others thought that he merely left town. Many suspected that he had been robbed walking around with all that money in his pockets. The city marshals of Boston even had the bottoms of the Boston Harbor and the Charles River dragged to see if they could find George Parkman's body. However, their searches came up with nothing.
Enter Ephraim Littlefield, a rural Yankee who was a janitor at the Harvard Medical School. He and his wife lived in the basement of the medical school adjacent to Webster's laboratory. Ephraim, poor and struggling, was tasked with obtaining cadavers for the purposes of dissection at the medical school and was very familiar with the ins and outs of the dissection laboratories.
Littlefield had become suspicious of Webster, seeing as one morning, very early in the morning, Webster was burning the furnace in his laboratory so hot that the other side of the wall was too hot to touch. Littlefield watched Webster from underneath his door to his laboratory. Seeing that Webster made 8 separate trips from the fuel closet to the furnace was very curious to Littlefield, and he resolved to investigate further when it was safer to do so. On Thanksgiving Day, Littlefield broke into Webster's office using a crowbar, a hatchet, and a drill. His wife stood guard outside. He began chiseling away at the wall underneath Webster's lab privy, and he discovered a small tunnel that entered into a vault where the privy emptied into a smaller pit. It took him only 1 hour to chisel through 2 layers of bricks, where he decided that he would come back another day to finish the job.
The next day, Littlefield returned to chiseling until he managed to create a hole in the wall that looked into an empty space, with a large enough draft that it put out his lantern. Letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, Littlefield began searching the opening until eventually his eyes settled on what looked like a human pelvis bone on top of a small mound of dirt. His worst fears had been confirmed.
Horrified, Littlefield ran to the house of Jacob Bigelow, another Harvard professor, and Bigelow then alerted the city marshal. The charred and dismembered remains of George Parkman were then excavated from Webster's lab privy. Webster was arrested that same evening for murder and pleaded with the city marshal that it was in fact Littlefield who planted the evidence in his privy to frame him. Unfortunately, the gruesome discoveries in Webster's laboratory continued as they found strange acid stains on the floor and a whole jawbone with teeth attached in the furnace. The trial of John White Webster began on March 19, 1850, with Judge Lemuel Shaw presiding over the case. If convicted, Webster would be sentenced to death by hanging. On the 3rd day of the trial, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. testified that the body had been dismembered by somebody with knowledge of dissection and anatomy, ruling out Littlefield as a suspect.
George Parkman's dentist also took the stand that day and showed the jury how the jawbone that was discovered at the scene of the crime matched the plaster molds that he had made of George Parkman's teeth. The poor dentist burst into tears, demonstrating to the jury how the individual teeth fit perfectly into his impression of Parkman's teeth. This was the first testimony in American history that included dental records to prove the identity of a victim, a practice that would become commonplace in the forensic field up until this very day. In the end, the evidence against Webster, both circumstantial and forensic, was convincing enough to the jury to unanimously convict him of murder. Upon the reading of the verdict, George Bemis reported, "The prisoner, who upon the sentence of the jury had turned deadly pale, but who had stood up with a firm bearing to receive the verdict of the jury, immediately upon its announcement, grasped the rail in front of him and slowly sank down into his seat. Dropping his head, he rubbed his eyes beneath his spectacles with a trembling and convulsed motion as if to wipe away tears, and remained in that position for a few moments." On April 1, 1850, Judge Lemuel Shaw sentenced John White Webster to be hanged.
George Parkman's remains rest here in his family lot. The murder and discovery of George Parkman harmed his family irreparably. Once lively socialites, they became timid recluses, trying desperately to heal from the trauma of such an abhorrent crime and the loss of such an important loved one.